Hello and welcome to episode 27 of the Filmumentaries podcast. Thanks for joining me again. It's Jamie Benning here, talking to you from my hidden fortress here in southeast London. It's early June 2021. The weather is finally on the change here, I think. We've had a lot of rain, but the park I can see from my office window is looking abundantly green and lush and pleasing to the eye, so it's not all bad. If you're new to the podcast, do go back and check out the other 26 episodes available. Here's a little trailer that some other podcasts are running for me, and I think it gives you a good overview of what's come before. Join me, Jamie Benning, on the Filmumentaries podcast, particularly if you enjoy stories like designer Nilo Rodis Jamiro convincing George Lucas to push him around to help gain the support of his crew on the ailing Howard the Duck.
Blam! The door opens, it's George. Everybody gasps. George makes a beeline to me. I'm literally back against the wall.
Or hear puppeteer Tim Rose's emotional story behind that iconic Admiral Akbar shot in Return of the Jedi.
I believe the war is something to be proud of, but not to celebrate.
Or how Star Wars editor Paul Hirsch tackled cutting so many successful films.
The thing that I learned from working with De Palma is that tension depends on a clock. You need to have the sense that time is running out.
Maybe Oscar-winning sound designer Mark Mangini's insightful chat about his work on Blade Runner 2049.
Not a single sound from the original Blade Runner in the new film. A great deal of inspiration.
That's the Filmumentaries podcast with me, Jamie Benning. If you want to become part of the Filmumentaries family, you can donate via patreon.com/Jamie Benning. Just $12 a year would make a huge difference to me and enable me to focus more on the podcast and get bigger and better guests as well. A huge thanks to my new patrons, Lewis, Ting and Caroline. I'm so grateful to you. It really does blow me away when I get a new email from Patreon saying that there's a new patron all signed up, so thanks so much for that. Back in April 2021, the same weekend that I spoke to my previous guest, actually digital matte artist Jim Maxwell, I also spoke to filmmaker John Lefkowitz. Now, John is based in Pittsburgh, USA, where he works as a filmmaking lecturer. John has made a few films, but the one that caught my eye was Sight and Sound, the cinema of Walter Murch, which I found during a Google search. Walter Murch is someone I've been fascinated by for decades, and I was looking to watch some interviews with him. If you don't know who Walter Murch is, you certainly know his work. From his sound design and editing on Lucas's THX 1138 and Coppola's The Conversation, for which he was first nominated for an Academy Award, he's a fully fledged and highly respected editor. Apocalypse Now, Cold Mountain, and most recently Coup 53. A documentary that he's edited and worked on for a number of years. He also directed the bizarrely brilliant Return to Oz, a film that terrified my sister and I when we were kids. I don't think I've seen it in a very long time. It certainly left a mark, though. Walter is as much a philosopher as a filmmaker. If you haven't already done so, I highly recommend his book called In the Blink of an Eye. As a sort of editor myself in live TV, and just because I'm interested in the subject, I've read many books on film theory, and recently Paul Hirsch's career account a long time ago in a cutting room far, far away. But trust me when I say you've never read anything quite like In the Blink of an Eye. I mean, he talks about editing in a way that I never even considered. John's documentary takes several interviews with Murch with his distinctive voice and paints his words with film clips. It's expertly put together, and I really did enjoy watching it. I've watched it a number of times now. So here's my interview with documentarian John Lefkowitz, and I'll be back at the end for a bit more jabbering on. So for someone who hasn't heard of Walter Murch before, John, how would you go about describing him?
I would say Walter Murch is a philosopher of cinema, as well as an editor and a sound designer. He's all three of those things, and he has worked on some of the best films of the last 50 years, including Apocalypse Now, the Godfather trilogy, and The Conversation. Murch is one of the only editors that also does his own sound designing and re-recording. So he's just he's very interested in audio. He's very interested in the oral side of filmmaking, AURAL, not ORAL. And he has so many wonderful theories and insights about not only filmmaking, but about the creative process and about the human condition, really, human nature. And he's written a wonderful book called In the Blink of an Eye, which is basically a holy text for film students. And it's very short, it's to the point, and it has a lot of really crucial information and insights packed into its narrow length. And mostly it's about editing. And he's also been the subject of a book called The Conversations by Michael Ondaatje, who wrote The English Patient, which Murch edited and sound designed and won Oscars for those.
Yeah, that Blink of an Eye book, I read that when, I don't know, quite a few years ago now. It feels like I've read it a couple of times. I was really surprised that I hadn't thought about editing and filmmaking in that way ever. And I studied film at college as part of my media production degree, but I'd never come across such a philosophical look that doesn't kind of dance around the facts. He manages to communicate these things in such a clear and concise way, but in such a way that you won't have thought of before, and therefore it somehow fixes in your mind. So what was the jumping off point for you making the documentary then? Was it a kind of a fascination about the man himself?
Yeah, so I'm 38 now. I discovered Murch when I was about 15 and read In the Blink of an Eye around there, and just became obsessed with him. I just, like, The English Patient had just come out maybe a year or two before then, and I wasn't the biggest fan of that film, but I was a huge Coppola fan, and The Conversation, which I have the poster of behind me,
Very nice,
is in my top 5. Has been in my top 5 since I was a teenager. I just am obsessed with that film, and I know it's kind of a film school cliche, just like In the Blink of an Eye is as a text, but I don't care. I love it, and I've been a filmmaker since my senior year of college. Basically, made a feature then, that was kind of a comedy, made a thriller a few years later, and then veered more into nonfiction and realized that's where my niche is. And I made a film about John Lennon that played at South by Southwest and won an award from Michael Moore, and it was called Rubber Soul. And then after that, I was kind of trying to figure out what my next film would be. I spent a lot of time working on a Shakespeare-themed film. It's kind of a Shakespeare mashup. And simultaneously, while I was making these features, I was making video mashups, posting them on YouTube and Vimeo. Most of them, a few hundred people have seen, but a few of them went viral. And I just realized that the nonfiction thing with features and the mashup art is really where my talents lie. And so I decided that I was just going to keep making these things, even though I wasn't making any money off of them for copyright reasons. But it was just a passion of mine. So one of the ideas that I had was just to do tributes to different people that I admire, and I made one about Fred Rogers, made one about David Bowie the week he died. And then I was like, well, I've got to make one for Murch. And I started out just making, maybe 2 or 3 minutes, taking some clips from The Cutting Edge, The Magic of Movie Editing, that great documentary that is also a film school staple. And I keep talking about film school because I teach at 2 different film schools here in Pittsburgh. And I quickly realized that 2 or 3 minutes was not gonna cut it. You could not summarize all that Murch had to say. He's so substantive that you really have to go deeper. So once I got started, I could not stop. I started to just download everything I could, ripping everything I could, commentaries, lectures, Q&As, interviews, of course. And I landed on this incredible 18-hour interview that he did with a group called Web of Stories. And they've interviewed lots of very notable people from the 20th century and early 21st, physicians, philosophers, Nobel Prize winners, and then people like Stan Lee, the Marvel guy, and then Murch. And it was done in, I think, 2017, and I started this film in late 2017. And I selected the whole thing, just, broke down the entire interview into sound bites that I thought could potentially be of use, started categorizing them by different subjects. These are when he talks about music, this is when he talks about sound design, this is when he talks about, films that he worked on that for whatever reason did not find success. And finally, I realized I had a feature on my hands, but I had never met Murch. I had never, I didn't really, the only person who knew that I was working on this was my wife. And she ended up, I credited her as producer, as I do on lots of my films, because she gave me so much creative advice.
Yeah.
Including
feedback and
including dividing the film into chapters. Instead of it just being one long stream of consciousness, it's like, she said, break it up with titles, just like I did with Rubber Soul, actually. And that was also something that came late in the process. So I took about 7 months to get to the first cut, then did a few revisions. Should I keep going? I mean, I can, at this point, it's like the movie's done, but...
Yeah, but one thing I was going to say was that there's some serious, I'm smiling away here because there's some serious parallels between you and I in what we do, because I made my Filmumentary feature-length things by taking snippets from things already publicly available and trying to craft them into some sort of different narrative that told a bit of a different story, and like doing mashups, and as you said, like some go viral, some get nothing, and you can't quite put your finger on what's happened. I mean, I released one that I thought was great about Robert Watts, the producer, and it's had like 1,000 views. I released one about the puppeteers in Jabba the Hutt, and it got 250,000 in a day. It's, it's but they're both interesting to me. But it's interesting what people find interesting. But Walter Murch is actually interesting for me, not only because I read his book, but I actually met him at one time. I did. Yeah. I'll tell the story a little bit just to put it in context, because I was working. I worked in the TV industry for an outside broadcast company, working on motorsport and football and horse racing and all sorts of things. Mm-hmm. And they lost the Formula One contract that I was working on, the motorsport contract. So they made me redundant. I kind of put my hand up and said, look, I'm young, I'm 24 at this time. Take me, kind of thing. I was still living with my parents, I think. Mm-hmm. And I ended up taking a job with a company called London Editing Machines. Now, they supplied Steenbecks and Chems and Lightworks and Avid and Final Cut just as it was coming in. And there was that hybrid period where they were working on film and on digital in the same room often. And one day I got this call from my South African colleague Patrick. Said, meet me in London, jump in the van, we're going up to this facility up in North London. And I went into this place, and it was like a converted church, and I walked in, the door kind of shut behind me. Patrick went off to the bathroom, I think, and the doorbell rang, and I'm kind of looking around and nobody's answering the door. And I open the door, in walks Walter Murch and says, oh my God, in that hugely distinctive voice of his, there was absolutely no doubt in my mind that it was him. Good morning, young man. I'm Walter. And I was like, yes, I know you are. I said, look, I don't work here, but I think I'm here to set up your edit. So I was there to set up the edit for Cold Mountain. So he did that on Final Cut, right? So I remember the room really well because he had all the storyboards on the right. He had the standing bench. And I remember my boss saying, this guy needs a standing bench. He always likes to stand when he edits. I do often as well, which is interesting. and he
It's
had,
supposed to be much healthier.
yeah, yeah. It allows you to get that distance and walk away from it and kind of walk in the room while it's playing and see if something catches your eye that isn't quite right. But anyway, yeah, he had his storyboards on the right, his final cut there on the kind of raised standing desk, and then a big preview monitor over to the left. And I was just like, oh my God, and ding dong, the doorbell rings again. I open it and it's Sidney Pollock. Good morning, I'm Sidney. He was
producing.
Yeah, he was post-production supervisor on that. And yeah, so I remember thinking, God, I've got to go and, revisit all of his stuff. So I remember watching THX and Apocalypse Now and everything else. That job didn't last very long, but that was one of the few moments where I really kind of, saw some of my heroes right there in front of me.
Oh, that's a great story. Have you read Behind the Scene, the book?
I haven't. I haven't.
Oh.
I know it's about. Yeah, I really should read that because
you're part of the narrative there.
Well, I remember going up there a couple of times because he had some difficulty with some drives or something, and we had to copy some stuff over. And yeah, I mean, it's all a bit of a blur now. This is 04,
yeah, that's what the book's about. It's all like his. I mean, Final Cut was not designed for features.
That's right.
And, and now it's defunct, but I mean the old Final Cut.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. So what?
I think you'll like the book.
Yeah. I'm going to have to get hold of it. I saw it's around on Amazon still, on occasionally on eBay. So I mean, editing really. If we get into sort of editing and what it is, I mean, it's the craft. To me, as I edit, in live TV. So I'm making things very, very quickly to get back out to air, mostly in sports, some entertainment shows and things as well. But also I do a bit of post-production as well. But to me, it really seems like it's the real crafting of a movie. It's been shot with an intention. There's a script that they've used to shoot with. But when you get into the edit, there's so many things you can alter, you can change, you can present in a way that wasn't necessarily there as an idea in the beginning, but also you have these happy accidents as well. And what I liked about your documentary, and I should give it its full name, Sight and Sound, The Cinema of Walter Murch. What I liked about it was that you used obviously a lot of Walter's techniques to do with how sound is used, how vision is used, the juxtaposition of things, and it really felt like it could have been made by himself in a way.
Well, that's a compliment. Thank you.
So, did you find inspiration from his films in the way that you edited it?
Yeah, I would love to say that I was just thinking about what would Murch do with every single cut, but at a certain point, I just kind of had to feel it out and just kind of cut in an organic way. I will say that certain things like Murch has this great little very nitpicky pet peeve about you can't cut on a blink. He has the whole thing about blinks and how a cut is like a blink, and when we blink we're processing thoughts, but also just literally visually you shouldn't cut when the eyes are closed, in mid blink. It'll be very awkward feeling. And so I remember that came up a few different times because I'm working with so many different medium shots and close-ups of actors, from all these great movies, and just making sure, I'm not going to cut on Orson Welles with his eyes closed.
Yeah.
But then on a larger scale, Murch has that great line, "When in doubt, cut it out." And there were several things that I had in the original cut was 100 minutes. And I had this long section about the rain people and this sound design that he did for it, which I thought was interesting, but Talia, my wife, was just this is way too in the weeds. And then there was one moment with where I loved that he talked about when you are cutting for a really long time, you lose sight of what's good and what's not really. I mean, you lose your objectivity in a way.
Yeah.
And so this happened to me a lot when I was working in advertising in Los Angeles. I was editing trailers and TV spots for movies. And, we would go through so many different versions and watch these things over and over again. And they were just 30 seconds or 2.5 minutes at the most. After a while, you become numb to it. And then by the end, sometimes you're just all right, let's just take that part out. but like that was the part that really excited you in the beginning.
Yeah.
And so he has this whole thing about how you really have to be careful about what you're cutting out, because it might be wonderful, and it might just be that you're desensitized to how wonderful it is. And interestingly enough, I used I'm a big Judd Apatow fan, and I used the 40-year-old version for that, when the very end, when the that wonderful sequence where they're singing Age of Aquarius. And I don't know, it was just that's what came to my mind. Like for the most part, it was like I was listening. Once I had all the sound bites, I just said, I just lined them up and started thinking what movie could go here, what movie could go there. And for the most part, I didn't really second guess it. I'm pretty decisive as an editor, which I think all editors need to be pretty decisive. Otherwise they'd be like Terrence Malick, just like working for 10 years on everything. Yeah. So that's the movie that came to my mind for that, for some reason.
Yeah, it's great the way you use movie clips. You start off with the 2001: A Space Odyssey. When he's talking about how when we're gestating, we experience the world through sound, and then when we're born into sight, and it's the opposite for movies. And it really is just a very philosophical approach to movies, but without being sort of highbrow and maybe alienating some people. I actually was listening again to your documentary this morning while I was having breakfast. I just had it on because you can listen to it as an audio piece as well, because the use of sound is really good as well. And Walter has said himself that sound is a huge influence on people's attention. And I think the way you've managed to use the sounds within the documentary as well. My daughter was like, "Oh, that sounded like this, and that sounded like that," and your attention really is drawn from it. So the way you manipulated it in the way that he talks about it, I think really mirrors his own philosophies. I really like that about it.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
And I should clarify with the 40-hour version thing. I showed it to a friend of mine, and he said, "This kind of doesn't fit. I know you love Apatow, but it doesn't really fit in with all the other clips that you're using, and so I don't think the point is as important as you think. You should probably just take this section out." And I did, and I think the movie works better for it. So that's very much like a when in doubt, cut it out situation. Yeah,
it's really important, that phrase. I think about that phrase a lot. In my job, I'm editing things. I might have a minute and a half to edit a 15-second like tease to the break because a goal has just happened in soccer, and you're trying to edit it where it makes sense, and maybe you're adding a commentary grab to it, and you just have to know what you're going to do and do it. And then you think, I don't need that, and it's got to go. You can't try it and take it out and put it back in. You just have to get rid of it. So I think, coming from that kind of background, it can go both ways, actually. Sometimes when I'm doing post-production stuff, I'll just decide, no, don't need that. But what I tend to do is I slide things along the timeline just in case I need them back. Because
you
otherwise,
never know.
You do end up, though, with so many versions sometimes of things.
Oh, my God.
I was really surprised when I was reminded that Walter talks about how he edits dialogue scenes often without the sound to give him, again, that distance that he needs to focus on the picture itself. I don't think I could do that in a way. I mean, I kind of have done it, because if I'm editing to music, I'll sometimes turn the music off just to see if it works without, because if it doesn't work, it's not going to work with. But that's just, like I say, a very quick thing for live TV. But doing it in a post-production film environment, movie, a feature environment, that must be quite a step to make. I don't think there's many editors that probably use that technique.
No, I've never heard of anyone else doing it. And I frankly, I've never tried it. I think like that's a very Murch specific technique. Like he just, he has a feel for it, and he doesn't care that you're not able to hear it. He's okay with it ending up incoherent and then finessing it a little bit later. And I think he says like the majority of the time it works, which I just find astounding. He must be a really good lip reader. But I would want to just cut right to it, get to the point.
I can only assume that he's kind of heard those takes so many times that he's got it fixed in his head that he knows what they're going to say. And then maybe as a heading towards the last pass, he's checking it with no sound. Surely he can't begin like that.
No. Yeah, he probably knows the script inside and out too. He works so hard on everything that he just throws himself in to every project.
Yeah, I watched The Conversation again a couple of weeks ago, actually. Hadn't seen it for a long time. And when you talk about, he kind of doesn't mind if there's an ambiguity there, and he doesn't mind if it's kind of confusing to the viewer. But that film is all about that. You don't know what you're listening to, who you're listening to, when is it, why is it, how, like what's going to happen, what happened previously. And the way he... it's very meta, really, in its creation, because it's, a sound editor editing a sound snooper. It's like it's a great film, though. It really does have such atmosphere created through that long lens stuff, and also the sound is a massive part.
Yeah, the whole thing's a metaphor for sound design and sound recording. Murch even looks a little bit like Harry Call, Gene Hackman, and the. Going back to what you were saying about how the editor is shaping the film in a way that makes it pretty different from how it was conceived, or how even when it was shot, you can do so much with changing the movie around in editing, and with The Conversation. And I included this. I made sure to include this in the film, that he was really like instrumental in the writing of it, but writing from the cutting room, where he came up with the different pronunciation or different emphasis of "he'd kill us if he had the chance."
The famous line, yeah.
Because Frederick Forrest, the actor, read it that way just for fun, for one take, and that is like the major twist. Like that's kind of the resolution of the movie. And Coppola didn't come up with that. That was Murch. And Murch also came up with the toilet thing with overflowing from his childhood memory, and so he's just this. It just shows you, like, it's a very anti-auteur theory film. It shows you like the editor is probably just as important in many ways.
Yeah.
If you have a bad editor, then you don't really. It's really hard to have a good movie.
It really reminds us that the filmmaking process is a collaborative effort. It really is a collaborative effort, and as you say, the editor being really important. I spoke to Paul Hirsch on one of the first episodes of my podcast. Of course, amazing list of films. I mean, you look at his list of films, it's like they're all in my top 20 ever,
Yeah,
And
have you read his book?
Yes, I have. Yeah.
It's terrific.
Yeah, another great book. I
just finished it.
Yeah, and again, it's not a manual on editing. It's not. No. It's not even a biography as such. It's somewhere in between. And again, he gets philosophical about things as well. And yeah, he's an interesting guy, Paul. And he, of course, came on board with Star Wars after John Jimpson had done an early edit, which was just your standard master close-up, master. And you look at that early Canteen edit, which is out there in the public domain and in my Star Wars Begins filmumentary, and you realise that there's no energy in it whatsoever. And it's literally those tiny little trims, and it's just making those little... It's all in the eyes in that scene, actually. If you watch it in the 4K release now, you can see... Guinness and Hamill and Ford's eyes all kind of checking each other out, which you don't see on, I didn't grow up seeing that on VHS. And just, the way those guys put that film together at the last minute. And again, editors inventing, the script, that there was the battle at the end of the movie. It wasn't intercut in the way that it eventually ended up in. I think that was Marsha Lucas's idea. Of course, another very skilled editor.
Oh, yeah.
So it's editing is such a integral part of the process. Just one little change can change the entire movie. And like you say, with that one line in The Conversation, you kind of go, did I hear that right? Like you don't know whether you're kind of pulled into the mystique of the moment, which is what's fantastic about that film.
And Hirsch, in a long time ago in A Cutting Room Far, Far Away, the book, talks about what you were saying at the beginning about how editing is, basically how important editing is, but the fact that it's not like any other art form, and it's really what makes a movie a movie. Like it's the most cinematic part of the process. Like cinematography is rooted in photography. Acting, of course, is, goes back to antiquity, but editing is only like 150 years old, really, or 120 years old. So
yeah, there's a film critic over here, Mark Kermode, who talks about cinema being
I've heard
linked to kind of the way we dream in a way, like because we edit in our dreams, and we go from scene to scene. I had a very vivid dream last night. I won't bore you with it, but maybe it'll make a good movie one day. No, I've always been. No, it's fine. I've always been fascinated with editing, though, and I wish I was a better editor.
Well, to be able to edit live TV, I mean, that's like
it's a different skill.
That's got to take a lot of and also like the temperament. You just have to be so. I could never do it. It's just so much pressure.
Yeah, when you're directing live TV, and I've directed a few little bits over the years, you make that decision and it sticks. You can't change it,
Right.
But then there's the near live editing, which is the stuff I do the most, where you do have a moment to change it, but you might be playing it in 3 seconds time, and you're losing a shot and extending another one very, very quickly. But wow. I don't know about yourself, but I first kind of realized what editing was when my granddad gave me a cassette tape recorder. It sounds like I'm Harry Cool here, but he gave me a cassette tape recorder that had a little handle on it, like a field recorder, and you could walk around with it, and it ran on big D batteries, and I didn't have a set of headphones or anything with it, but I had one tape. And I used to just go around and record noises in the garden, and I recorded the conversations that my parents were having without them realizing. Again, maybe the conversation was more of a biography. And then what amazed me about that was that I could record part of something, stop it, and then record part of something else, and then put the two together, and you've got something brand new. And even more so when my granddad got a 2-deck hi-fi where you could dub from one tape to the other. And, I used to record things off the TV just in audio. That's how I first really got to know those early 70s and 80s movies. Where did you first kind of come across editing?
Well, before I even get to that your story sounds very similar to Murch's. He got into sound design and editing because he got like a tape recorder. This is the 1950s. And he would just, once he realized you could manipulate, like that was it. So I started in the era of VHS. So I was putting 2 VCRs together and just, play, record, stop, rewind, and linear video editing. And that's when I was about 12. That is when I became conscious of it. Like, I don't remember really thinking about it before.
Yeah, it's it kind of, I think as well, when I did my university degree, it was the bit I enjoyed the most. We shot a little horror movie in the campus, and I just remember the editing. It was linear editing. I mean, non-linear did exist then, but our college was a bit behind, so we had just a Sony controller and a couple of Beta SP decks, I think it was. And just being able to lay on a sound or a sound effect, just bringing something alive. Because that's the thing a lot of people don't realize is when editors are working on features, they're often working with on-set recording,
right? And
they have to imagine what that film is going to sound and look like, months down the line. It must be quite a daunting process.
Yeah, I mean, I prefer just to polish as I go, which I know is not the norm, but like I usually do my own sound design, so I'm just kind of, working as I go. I can't leave something kind of messy or raw. I can't move on until I polish it up, and Murch is the opposite.
Yeah, I have that same problem that I want to kind of finesse it as I go because I'm worried I'm going to forget about what I'm thinking it should be like right now.
Exactly.
So he must have an enormous brain to kind of hold all of that in, and maybe maybe a trust in his instinct as well that he'll get back there and know what's right for it once the whole picture is roughly kind of outlined. But very, very different approach to the way I would do it.
And when just to continue with the linear video, because with 2 VCRs, you're so limited, and it also looks terrible. There's like a little rainbow on every cut. But then in that's when I was in middle school, and then in high school, we had this AV center, audiovisual center, and they had linear video editing that, had a little jog shuttle, and buttons, and it was a much better setup, and it allowed you to overdub audio. And that for me was like heaven, because my favorite part of the whole process still is merging music and image. And so just being able to lay a track over, and which was impossible when I was just using 2 VCRs, was just game changing. And then my senior year of high school, we switched over to nonlinear. That's about like 2000, and it was Premiere, and now I'm on Premiere. 20 years later.
Yeah, I'm Premiere. I was Final Cut initially, and then I'm on Premiere. But so sometimes when you lay music on or lay a sound effect on, or even in the editing process as a whole, you have these happy accidents as well sometimes, where you just think, wow, that I didn't mean to do that, but that works exactly. Did you have that at all in creating your documentary, if you can remember?
I would have to think about it, but I mean, I know that Murch had the best one, which is in Apocalypse Now, the cutting from the helicopter opening to the ceiling fan, and having the sound from the helicopter over the ceiling fan, and just like both the graphic match and the audio match there is just like perfection. And he describes it as being, just a total shock to him. He just jumped back and had no intention of doing that. It just happened as a mistake, basically.
Yeah, and it's one of those shots that if the sound hadn't been right, or if the transition hadn't been right, it would have jumped out to us as viewers, and it would have been jarring. But instead, right. Well, maybe jarring is how it should be, but jarring in the wrong way, at least the way it is now. And I think as well, like he talks about how in the days of physical film editing, that you couldn't preview a transition, which is just crazy, isn't it? When you think now, especially in that film where you have these multiple layers all crossing each other in different directions, to visualize that and to have confidence that the lab is going to get it as you intend is crazy.
That is something that would drive me nuts. Just wanting to do a dissolve, but not being able to see it, or even just a tight, like, up until nonlinear editing, all the titles were done in labs, and they just had to, just put temps up there, placeholders, or just wait for the real thing. And I can't imagine.
I wonder if they ever just physically got the two like cells and just kind of overlaid them on a light box or something, just to see if they did work. I don't know. I went, as I said, when I had my little foray into that film world when I was working for London Editing Machines, it was that transition period. There was an Avid at one end of the room, there was a Steenbeck at the other end of the room, and the two worlds were trying to combine. So there was a film numbering machine that you'd put the film through to punch a number down the film, so that they had a reference to it, not only on the film but also on the Avid, and they were using this like another piece of software as a database to connect the two. This was on Tim Burton's Big Fish. I met Tim briefly as well. He asked me what fish design I preferred on the wall, and I said that one.
That's awesome.
That was pretty cool. And I couldn't.
That's like having a typewriter in one corner and a computer in the other.
Yeah, and just trying to interface them in some way. And what struck me is that because I'd come from TV where we'd just gone 16:9, and we weren't HD yet, but we were 16:9 at least. And I remember Nadia, who was the assistant editor on the Steenbeck kept breaking, and we had like a film rewinding machine. You'd put the film on, it would rewind, and the kind of the drive belt would go on it, and I'd have to fix that a few times. And I just thought, how is it this antiquated? With those syncing devices where you'd lay the audio on one sprocket and the film on another, and you'd sync them on the clapperboard. I just couldn't believe that it was still like that after however many decades. And then all of a sudden this jump occurred, didn't it?
Yeah. No, that was a quantum leap. But before that, I mean, the Steenbeck was still seen as an improvement on the Moviola, right? Like, and Murch talks about that in The Blink of an Eye, the just being able to watch the film sped up and not be able to miss a frame, really. I mean, not really, but like when you're scrubbing through a timeline, even like the highest res computer, like sometimes you there's a bit of a lag, and he just loved being able to go back and forth, rewind and fast forward. And I think he says in The Blink of an Eye that he prefers that was his favorite, the Ken.
Because the moviola resembles more like a sewing machine more than anything else.
Right. Yeah. Upright. Yeah.
Yeah. Like they edited some of Star Wars on moviolas, and I think Verna Fields did Jaws on a moviola, and I just imagine, like I would now, I'd show my producer over my shoulder what I'd edited. You imagine you're both sort of trying to bury your faces in this like 9-inch, well, probably not even that, it's probably like 6-inch screen, and you couldn't leave the frame there for too long because it would burn through it, and it's just
well, that's it. In Sight and Sound I used the clip from the Coen Brothers Hail Caesar, and Josh Brolin he's the head of the studio, and he's literally bending down and looking into a like 4-inch by 4-inch screen.
Yeah, and it's interesting that Walter talks about how he went back to do the DVD version remaster for The Conversation, I think it was, and he kind of wanted to look at it to see if he could really tell the difference as to whether, I know it's edited on film, does it look different to how it would be now if I edited it on a computer? And he said actually he didn't really notice much of a difference. So it just goes to show the craft that those men and women had in that period. I always think that, when I spoke to Paul Hirsch, I thought he would kind of harken back to those days. And he said, oh no, I love the Avid. There's just it's so laborious to do it the old way. You've got to have somebody with you, an assistant that's got all of your trims, and then all the trims are logged. And goodness knows what has been lost over time, right? Just where people have chucked something in a edit bin. I
know, but Hirsch and Murch are friends, and like Murch's quote is on the back of the book, and for Coup 53, the film that Murch just edited and co-wrote, co-directed, basically, he and Paul Hirsch had a conversation about it that was streamed on YouTube.
Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah, you saw it. Okay,
yeah, it's very cool.
It was and both of those editors, they're roughly the same age. They both were in the American New Wave. One working with Coppola, one working with De Palma, and Lucas. I guess they have Lucas in common, and so they both had no hesitancy diving in to digital. And Murch always says, like, I'll very gladly learn a new program, and I hate that. Like I hope I'm on Premiere forever because I've gotten so comfortable with it. But I felt the same way about Final Cut 7, and I hated Avid. I was on Avid for 5 years, and just never got used to it. It wasn't like intuitive enough, not organic enough. But anyway, so both of those guys, like in Hirsch's book, he just talks. For like one sentence or one paragraph about it took me like a week or two, and I was fine with cutting it. And as you say, like, it's the craft and the art of it, really. Like the art of editing, it doesn't matter ultimately what format you're cutting in.
Yeah, I always he was talking Paul to me about how one of his friends, his father was a tailor, and he was working all day on sewing machines, and he said, I don't want to do that, and he ended up being an editor on a moviola, and he said, look, you've got your trims here, you've got it around your neck, you've ended up doing the same thing. And I think that analogy does sort of work, because you think as a dressmaker, you're kind of given the fabrics to work with, and the fabric in this sense is the shot film, and you've got to put together the garment to make sure it fits, that it works, that it's makes sense, and all of that stuff.
That's a great analogy.
And it's amazing just how a tiny little change can just flip things, which has always fascinated me.
Yep.
So Walter talks about film really being the only art form that can utilize silence, really, because if you do it in the theatre, everyone kind of assumes the actors forgotten their lines. If you do it in just sound, like on radio or music, it's kind of jarring because you think, has my stereo broken or my phone broken? But with film, it can have a real impact, can't it?
Yes.
Are there any particular examples that you like in film where silence is used? Putting you on the spot now, John.
No, well, the first thing that came to mind was just how Murch is really talking about thought. The whole thing about silence is that you can do that in film because you can see the thoughts. You can see a person thinking, an actor thinking. And so I just, for that scene, for that section, I just found a bunch of moments of people just kind of sitting there thinking, and there was Ozu, Tokyo Story, and Do the Right Thing. And that moment, I just, put like some wind, some kind of ambient sound over it. But really what's happening there is Ozzie Davis is getting shouted at by people much younger than him who are saying like he's out of date. He's they're very abrasive and but just to isolate the thought, and to see that scene without any dialogue, completely changes it and makes you focus on what Murch is talking about. The end of The Godfather 2, when Michael Corleone is just sitting there, like that shot is wonderful, and he's you can only imagine how many thoughts he's having about how horrible of a person he is. But
you can fill in the gaps yourself. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know, the first thing that comes to mind as far as outside of sight and sound, when I was watching Blood Simple for the first time, I was in high school. My dad came into the room and said, "These Coen brothers are not afraid of silence." And it was a scene, I think in a parking lot, maybe, with cameras it's a tracking shot, daytime, just not much going on visually, but in terms of the soundtrack, you can hear like just some diegetic sound coming from the cars, and but it's a long time before someone actually speaks. So I'll never forget what my dad said, that they're not afraid of silence, and I love that.
Very canny observation. So we're about halfway through my interview with documentarian John Lefkowitz. We'll be back after these short messages.
My name is Brandon Winerdy, and if you're like me and you love the making of books and behind-the-scenes documentaries about Star Wars, you may just love my podcast, Talking Bay 94, where I interview the cast and crew of A Galaxy Far, Far Away. Named one of the top Star Wars podcasts by Apple, with over 100 episodes and interviews with winners of more than 30 Academy Awards, no matter which one you choose, you'll find an in-depth conversation that is unexpected, inspirational, and enlightening. Whether it's Phil Tippett or Dennis Murin, Timothy Zahn or Sam Witwer, I can promise you'll learn something new about your favorite moments in the saga. Listen to Talking Bay 94 wherever you listen to podcasts, or head to talkingbay94.com to see our full guest list. Thanks, and may the Force be with you.
Are you tired of pop culture podcasts where the hosts exist in a constant, blissful state of agreement? Well, fear not. Let me introduce you to the Chinstroker vs. Punter podcast. Mike is an ex-film student with a penchant for David Lynch, and Paul is your man on the street who likes what he knows and knows what he likes. Join us fortnightly as we discuss what we've been watching from our own very different perspectives. You can find us at csvsp.libsyn.com. Chinstroker vs. Punter is a proud member of the Pod Syndicate family of podcasts.
Here's what some people are saying about the Projection Booth podcast.
The Projection Booth is single-handedly the greatest film podcast you could ever listen to or could possibly want.
Top notch. 5 stars. This has quickly become one of my favorite film-related podcasts. Always interesting.
A completely unpretentious yet fully comprehensive look at films from all genres.
The Projection Booth podcast, with new episodes available every week at projectionboothpodcast.com.
I spoke to Mark Mangini, who's a sound designer. He worked on Mad Max Fury Road, he worked on Blade Runner 2049, he worked on Raiders and Gremlins and Inner Space and everything. And he was talking about the use of silence. And he said, don't get me wrong, never use actual silence. Because then you will get people getting up out of their seats and going to speak to the theatre manager. He said you have to have something there, but there are certain tones you can play in, or certain, ways you can reduce the sound to have that effect. But you kind of have to earn that as well, or the next scene has to come in hard on the audio or something to kind of complement it. I think some people do kind of overuse it. It's seen as a cheap technique sometimes, but I think when it's done properly, it really does help get the message across.
Right. Oh yeah, I mean it lends itself mostly to horror, of course, because any suspense, if you have silence and then a jump scare or something, some kind of shock with a big moment on the soundtrack, that's going to be a nice contrast. But also, like, I'm just thinking of like art films, like every film that has won the Palme d'Or in the last 20 years, like I'm sure there's a ton of of moments you can just isolate that just have no dialogue at all. But as you say, like, it's not real silence. There's always something on the soundtrack, but there is, I mean, I can only think of one example where there literally is, well, no, two, where there's literally nothing on the soundtrack. In 2001, when Hal kills one of the astronauts, he's struggling in space, and in space there's no sound.
Sure.
So literally Kubrick just cuts out the soundtrack there, because that's the diegetic sound.
Yeah, exactly.
The other thing
there is none. Yeah,
is a film that I admire more than I enjoy, but I've given a lot of thought to it, which always is a good sign. Under the Skin by Jonathan Glazer.
Terrifying film.
Very terrifying. And whenever Scarlett Johansson takes one of these men into the black hole, a black hole doesn't have sound either. And so I remember I saw it in at the ArcLight Theater in Los Angeles, which ArcLight, of course, is now no longer, unfortunately. But it was a wonderful chain that had great sound and projection, visual quality. And it was so disorienting to have a regular, relatively normal soundtrack and then just everything cut out. And you could hear someone 20 rows behind me eating their popcorn. It was just pure silence. So, but for the most part, that's very rare.
There's something about that, though, when you do have those moments of silence, and that film is a great example, Under the Skin, because you start to feel uncomfortable that you're in the room with all of these people with no sound.
Yeah.
And it's like there's a tension building and it needs to be broken. And the longer it goes on, it's almost like a little kind of game of chicken with the audience. Like, how long can we keep this going? I like that.
Yeah, it's a challenge to the audience. And when I think of silence, I think of, like, in painting, negative space. When you have stuff on the soundtrack, it's like that. These are the parts where the painter painted something, and then there's got to be some part of the canvas that's still white, and that's the silence. So the yin and the yang. Yeah,
you gave that example where Walter's talking about in Star Wars, everything has music. It just kind of needs that. Wall. This is just wall-to-wall music, and it's the John Williams has said about it himself that it's the emotional part of the film that's missing that he's then able to provide, and without it, that's ceremony scene that you show, the medal ceremony, that lovely YouTube video where there's just all the sound stripped off apart from coughing and shuffling feet, and I think of the Dancing in the Street music video without the music as well, and you just hear the sneakers and the the grunting from Bowie and Mick Jagger. Yeah,
there's a reason George Lucas said the only thing that he was 100% satisfied with in A New Hope was the score.
Yeah, it's true. If you watch the film without sound, you can't conjure the emotion, but if you listen to the music without the film, it's still there.
Yes, that's right.
I liked the part where Walter talks about in your movie, talks about how he talks about awards and winning Oscars and things, and how he prefers it when he loses.
Right.
Now, if anyone else was to say that, you'd kind of go, I have a bit of trouble believing them. But with Walter, you absolutely believe him. He's not a grouch at all. He's just, what is it about awards that he doesn't like winning, do you think?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, first of all, Murch is, he can get away with that because of his demeanor, really. Like, he's such a humble guy and such like a kind person. From what I've only talked to him over email, but like the fact that he even got back to me, like there are some people that would just be prima donnas and just say, "Oh, someone made a documentary about me. They spent
that's great. So
he's
seen the movie.
Working on it. Who cares?"
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Oh, that's brilliant.
Multiple times.
Oh, brilliant.
So that was really like one of the highlights of my life, just having him see it, and he gave me a few little notes about it, just little things that I either were inaccurate or that I forgot to include, and so of course I accommodated him. And then
you're not going to turn down that advice.
No, of course not. And I have the original email framed in my office here that he sent me, and we've kind of become pen pals since then. And I got to attend like a little Zoom birthday party that was thrown for him, and he is just a really good soul. It's one of the only examples I've ever had where a hero of mine turned out to be a good person. But with awards, he can also say that because he's had the pleasure of winning. I mean, I doubt any person who's only been nominated, but has never won would be able to say that it's better to be nominated than to win. But and I don't know. The Oscars are that's a whole can of worms, and they're tomorrow. Actually,
yeah, that's right. Yeah, I used to stay up and watch them. They used to be on free TV here in the UK, but these days I think you can only watch it with subscription, like Sky TV. So I haven't watched them for years, and then you get all that BS in the morning where they can't. We have it on the breakfast shows where they can't show footage because it's embargo. It's like, come on. I was amazed as well when he goes on to talk about how he was fired from Tomorrowland. You think somebody fired Walter Murch? I mean,
well, that's the crazy thing. And Paul Hirsch actually talks about, I think it was Steel Magnolias, where David Shire, he scored The Conversation, he scored Return to Oz, very underrated film that was the only one that Murch directed, and Shire was fired from that film because the score just didn't work. They had to find a different composer. And so it's just like, it's pretty mind-blowing to hear that someone of that stature with that kind of talent could have been fired. But I mean, maybe in Shire's case it was justified, but certainly with Tomorrowland, it's because the movie sucks. It's just because Brad Bird, who made two masterpieces really, The Incredibles and Ratatouille, and The Iron Giant's also really good, just bit off more than he could chew, just could not make that human connection that he did with the other films. And it's just a really hard movie to sit through. And so Murch just, having to work on it months on end, is just, you got to shoot the chicken to scare the monkey.
Yeah.
And it's just a scapegoat,
But what
situation.
A scapegoat. I mean, that's a hell of a person to pick on.
I know.
I did watch that movie recently,
I'm sure
actually.
Brad Bird feels terrible about it.
Yeah, I'm sure he does. I did watch that movie recently with my 13-year-old daughter. We were just sort of flicking through Netflix one night, and it came along, and I was like, I never did actually see that. And about 20 minutes in, we both liked the concept, but about 20 minutes, half an hour in, we kind of looked at each other, and we both said at the same time, this doesn't work. There's something just missing. I don't know what it is. I can't quite put my finger on it. But it feels ambitious, but it just doesn't feel like it can kind of complete what it intends to set out to do.
That's right, and it's weird. Pixar has produced so many great films, but both Brad Bird and Andrew Stanton making the transition to live action. I mean, Brad Bird did make Mission Impossible, but that's kind of like a franchise that he's just being inserted into, whereas like Tomorrowland is like his vision. And Andrew Stanton made John Carter, which was like a massive flop, and I remember trying to watch that and not really enjoying it at all. But yeah, there's something about animation. I mean, it's of course it's still storytelling. It's still, it's just a different means to the same end. But yeah, maybe Pete Docter will make the next Palme d'Or winner.
Yeah, maybe. I also liked how he talks about, Walter Murch just talked about in the past, I think it might be in The Blink of an Eye. No, it must have been something more recently, where he talked about, editing is now something that pretty much everybody can do. We've got our phones, and we can all do it to a simple level. But then what is it, I wonder, that elevates it to an art form? Because I always think of the examples of, you take something like Lawrence of Arabia and that moment where he's revealed in the desert and the shot holds and eventually there's a cut and you're just like, wow. And then you've got Taken 3 where he jumps over the fence and there are 15 cuts in like two seconds or something. Got the two ends of the spectrum. And yes, we all can do it to a certain extent, but there's something about those particular editors like Paul Hirsch, like Walter Murch and many others that have just got this kind of understanding of how we think. Maybe it's something to do with how we think and how we process thought. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, that relates to Murch's whole think about it, every cut is a thought, and each new shot is a new thought. You're kind of creating like a sentence, and then a paragraph, and then a chapter, and then a novel. But with all my students, I see that they all can learn. Even the ones who like are not very computer savvy can just, they know how to hit C on the keyboard and click on the mouse and make a cut. But ultimately, it's not only a craft. It's also an art because it has a feel to it. You have to feel at what feels right and feels wrong when it comes to editing. And Murch talks about how emotion is the number one thing you should cut for in the rule of 6, which I couldn't include because it just made the film feel too much like a lecture and not enough like a movie that could be accessible to people outside of film, even though most of the people who've watched it are film people. but except my parents. But so like that feel, that rhythm is what art is all about, and it's not really something that you can just allow a computer to do and be expected to do in the same way. So yeah, does that kind of answer the question? I mean, it
does. I think it does. I'm interested to see what happens with kind of artificial intelligence. There's already, a toe is kind of dipped in that pond at the moment. My Google Photos will suddenly say, here's a video of your daughter, like, don't they grow up fast? And firstly, it's freaky. And then there's shots, and it's usually a mixture of video and photographs put together with music. Mostly it's absolute dross. But there was a couple where they actually evoked an emotional response from me. I kind of got a little bit choked up, and it was the content itself, but it does kind of point to where the industry could go in the next few years. And maybe AI won't be necessarily doing the cutting, but it will help you find the shots. So you might say, yes, I need a close-up of this character, and boom, there's your close-up. Or I need to search for emotion of some kind.
Right. There might be there might be less of a need for assistant editors. A lot of the technical stuff, I think, might just become even easier than it is now. But I mean, I remember seeing this article about the first pop song that was written by a computer, and it was like, people were saying like, it sounds like a Beatles song, and I'm a Beatle maniac. I played it and I was like, this is terrible. And it's just like, it feels like it was written, it could have been written by a human, but I mean, there is something off about it. And so, we have a long way to go.
Yeah, we do. I've seen examples of like soccer games, football as we call it here, of course, games being cut by a director who's been doing it for 20 years. And then on the monitor next to it, AI is cutting it. And it all works fine because there is a certain grammar, there's a certain rhythm in a soccer game. You go to the wide at this point, the close-up at this point, and the emotion shot at this point. But when something happens that's out of the ordinary, like play stops because there's an injury, or, if it was the 80s, you might get a streaker on the pitch running across with no clothes on. That's or a flare goes off in the crowd on a Champions League game or something. Then it just doesn't know what to do, and you need that human element to make that split-second judgment. And I think that's going to last for a very, very long time.
Yeah, the spontaneity of the human brain is crucial. And we were talking about how editing is like thought. And I mean, computers, as much as we think they do, they don't think. We think, humans think. And so you need someone who thinks in order to finally tell a story. So yeah, those are my 2 cents. So
one thing I should mention to the listeners, John, is that your documentary is available for free to watch. Where can people take a look?
That's right. It is on Vimeo, and as far as I know, it's available in every country that has Vimeo. So I've been able to see on Vimeo, like, the stats, and people are watching it in Brazil, people are watching it in India, and in the UK. So, and of course, here in the States. So you can just Google Sight and Sound, the cinema of Walter Murch, and I am pretty sure it'll come up right away. Or you just go to Vimeo and do a search for it.
Yeah, and then you can go down the rabbit hole of Walter Murch's life and career, starting with your film, and then reading the book he wrote, The Blink of an Eye, and then the book about him, as you mentioned. And there's so many other videos, and including that 18-hour interview, which is a hell of a thing.
Oh yeah.
It's I never get tired of listening to him, because you know that everything that comes out of his mouth has been considered and, digested in the same way that he edits. You trust him. You have a trust to the way he works. Right. And no, I really did enjoy your film, John, and I think anyone who's into cinema should watch it, because editing is a really important part of it. But Walter goes that extra step and manages to kind of bring it into a different realm. It's not a technical thing necessarily. It's just it's a feeling. It's an instinctual kind of ability he's got. So yeah, I do implore you, everyone, to go and see Sight and Sound, the cinema of Walter Murch. Thanks, John, for joining us, and good luck for projects in the future.
Thank you very much, Jamie. Glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm interested to see what John does next. I think he's got a keen eye for documentaries and putting things together in interesting ways. So yeah, I'll be watching out for what he does next. Coming soon, you'll hear my interviews with Roger Christian, set decorator on Star Wars and art director on Alien. Also Dan Perry, master of opening sequences on so many films. I'm really looking forward to that one. In just a couple of days, I'm speaking to Oscar-winning sound designer Gary Rydstrom. Can't wait to talk to him about T2 and Toy Story and Jurassic Park and Minority Report. I mean, Saving Private Ryan, the list just goes on and on. I've also got Joe Johnston coming on, which I'm amazed he said yes. He heard my interview with Nilo, and I was put in touch with him. And initially he said, I don't really do interviews on podcasts. But we just had a nice chat over email, and I think he just got the measure of my podcast, which is never about, salacious gossip. I'm not one of those mega fans who's just going to be fawning over my guests. I just want to have a nice conversation with Joe and find out more about his process and about his history, because I think his impact on cinema has been incredible, really. You look back to his early days on Star Wars right through to, some of the films he's directed in recent years. All rather exciting, so I really do hope that one comes off. And my previous guest, Jim Maxwell, was also very kind in putting me in touch with another director in the shape of John Patrick Shanley, director of Doubt, Congo, Joe versus the Volcano, and the new film Wild Mountain Thyme. And I'm going to be speaking to him in just a couple of weeks. It's fantastic. I feel like each time my guests just get better and better, so I'm really excited about that one too. Thanks for joining me again, and I hope you can do so for the next episode of the Filmumentaries podcast.